Evening gently descended over New York City, the sun set like a pale orange ribbon draped across old brick walls, stained and mottled with the marks of time. Amid the never-ending hustle of this city, there were still silent corners that few paid attention to, like the narrow alley behind a row of townhouses, where the last rays of sunlight timidly crept in, and the winter wind whistled through the cracks in the walls like a quiet, resigned sigh. Mrs. Ruth lived there in a small house built in the 1940s, with a low roof and white-painted walls now faded to a weathered cream. Out front was a small yard, covered in fallen leaves that no one bothered to sweep anymore. Since her husband passed away, the house had been home to only one person, a few photo frames on the shelf, an old radio that played jazz in the morning, and the steady ticking of a clock, a gentle reminder that time still passed, even if the heart had long paused somewhere in the past. Her children all had their own families now, living far away. They loved her, still called every week, but distance wasn't always measured in miles. Sometimes it was just a quiet afternoon with no one to talk to. That alone could make a heart feel empty. Every afternoon, Mrs. Ruth would open the back door, step out into the yard, and sit on a weathered wooden chair. She didn't read. She didn't knit. She simply sat, hands resting on her lap, eyes gazing toward the trash bin, tucked away in the corner of the alley, as if waiting for something, though even she didn't know what. The house was so quiet that sometimes she felt like she could hear the walls breathing, low and sorrowful, just like her. Mrs. Ruth didn't consider herself unfortunate. It was just that, at her age, people often remembered the old things, like the scent her husband used to wear, her son's voice when he was a child, or the clinking of dishes during family dinners. Now, those sounds only echoed in memory, faint, like kitchen smoke dissolving into the sky. Then one day, in that familiar setting, a faint noise made her pause, a rustling sound, very soft, coming from the trash bin behind the yard. At first, she thought it was the wind. It often made fallen leaves scrape against each other like that. But no, this time it was different. She stood up and slowly walked toward the sound. The winter breeze slipped through her thin sweater, cold like an invisible touch from the past. And there in the shadowy corner, between two gray brick walls, she saw it. A small creature trembling. Its fur was dirty gray, matted with trash and dust. One of its ears was gone. All that remained was a healed scar, rough and uneven like a painful memory. Its eyes were deep, but they held something, not fear but exhaustion, as if it had wandered far, suffered greatly, and now only had enough strength left to breathe and exist in silence. Mrs. Ruth didn't scream or approach. She simply stood frozen, staring. In a long suspended moment, her aged eyes met the dim gaze of the stray cat. It was like two dried up rivers meeting in a cracked land. No words were needed, no knowledge of where the other came from. It was just both were alone and both were cold. She exhaled softly, her voice barely a whisper to herself. There are things no one pays attention to, but they might be the whole world to someone who's tired. And so, a new story began. Unhurried, quiet, just a cat with a missing ear and an old woman who had lost her laughter many years ago. Mrs. Ruth couldn't remember the last time she was truly surprised. Maybe it had been long ago, when her children were small, or when her husband was alive and would make coffee each morning, calling her to watch the season's first snowfall. But that moment, when her eyes caught sight of the huddled creature beside the trash, made her heart skip a beat, like someone had gently knocked on a long-forgotten room of emotions. It was a cat, but unlike any cat she had ever seen. Its body was pitifully small, so thin that a strong wind might carry it away. Its gray fur was clumped, grimy. It reeked of old grease, garbage, and the grime of street life. One ear was missing. In its place was a faded, jagged scar, a silent testimony to some long-past trauma that never truly healed. It didn't meow, didn't cry out for help. It just lay there, trembling, deep eyes looking toward her, not quite fearful, more like the gaze of someone who had endured too much to hope for anything, worn out, weary. Mrs. Ruth didn't approach, didn't call, didn't wave. She simply stood there still for a long time, then turned back into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a small plate of boiled fish, not canned food, but leftovers from her lunch. She placed the plate on the doorstep, said nothing, and went back inside. The door closed behind her. The kitchen light remained on, but inside her, it felt like someone had placed a small stone cold and heavy. The next morning, the plate was empty. Only a few strands of gray fur and tiny paw prints remained on the thin layer of snow. She smiled softly, a fleeting curve of the lips, but enough to warm the gray morning. The following day, she placed another dish by the door, again fish, this time with a bit of soft bread. And so, the habit became part of her every afternoon, like a quiet invitation without expectation. A door was always left ajar, even if no one knocked. The cat came every day, just after sunset, when the first streetlights flickered on across the avenue. It never let her see it approach. It appeared when she wasn't looking, vanished when she turned around. But the plate was always licked clean, and sometimes even nudged closer to the doorstep, as if to say thank you in the smallest of ways. One evening, the snow arrived earlier than usual. The wind picked up, and Mrs. Ruth suddenly felt uneasy. She went to the back of the house, retrieved an old towel once used for her husband, and laid it near the step beneath the eaves where snow couldn't reach. A little later, peeking out the window, she saw it. Curled up in the towel, head resting on its front legs, eyes half closed, still trembling but no longer frantic, it was sleeping. There, on the towel of the person she had loved most. She didn't call, just sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, eyes moist, not knowing whether it was from emotion or memory. She named it Eli, a little light. Eli began responding to eye contact. It still didn't let her touch it, but no longer flinched when she stepped outside. It didn't run, didn't hide, just lay there, silent, like a shadow that had accepted its place in the light. Mrs. Ruth started leaving a small blanket on the porch. Then one day, she left the door ajar. Without being called, Eli stepped inside, hesitant, cautious, testing each tile with its paw. It didn't go far, just curled up beside the fireplace, like a cooling ember still holding warmth, and slept. From that day, it never left again. Eli had other scars beyond the missing ear. Along its back were bald patches, signs of oil burns or chemical spray. Whenever Mrs. Ruth gently wiped its body with a warm cloth, Eli would shrink away, eyes wide with fear before softening again. Around its neck was a faint groove, a mark of a chain worn too long. Every time the doorknob turned, it darted under the table, panicked, as if it might be dragged away. Perhaps its former owner had beaten it, chained it, abused it, then discarded it like a broken item no longer of use. Mrs. Ruth never asked about Eli's past. She knew that sometimes just being allowed to stay was enough. Eli wasn't the cuddly, fluffy, meowing kind of cat. It was quiet, rarely vocal, often stared out the window, and only liked places touched by sunlight. But that very quietness made it feel like a natural part of the aging home. On clear mornings, Eli would sit by the window, ears tilted back, eyes half closed, as if listening to something far away. In the evenings, it lay by Mrs. Ruth's feet as she knitted or read old poems. Some nights, when she dozed off in her chair, Eli would climb onto her chest and purr softly, as if to make sure she was still there. Time passed and Eli began to trust. It trusted the house, trusted the aged hand that always served just enough food, always laid the towel where sunlight fell, and Mrs. Ruth, the woman who had lived half her life in silence, began to change too. She smiled more. Each morning, the first thing she did was gently call, "Eli, where are you?" Then open the window, not just to let in light, but to let her heart open too. Eli was no longer an abandoned cat. It was part of the home, a breath in the wind, a gentle purr in the quiet, like a soft soundtrack for an old age that was no longer lonely. That winter arrived earlier than usual. The trees in the backyard had only just begun turning from gold to brown when the sky dropped a biting mist, wrapping around everything like a soaked woolen scarf. The wind no longer howled, but the cold crept deeper into every muscle, every layer of old wood in the house, making each step feel heavier than before. Eli still came, every afternoon, without fail. It never arrived while the sun was up. Only when the kitchen light was already on and the plate of food placed carefully on the doorstep would Eli appear, like a silent gray shadow, so light and fleeting that Mrs. Ruth sometimes wondered if she was only dreaming. In the beginning, it would eat and leave, but then there were days when it stayed a little longer. It didn't lie down nor move closer, just sat there, tail curled around its legs, head tilted toward the window as if gazing into a foreign world. Mrs. Ruth still didn't call out, didn't wave. She only looked, with a gentle gaze that seemed to say, "Whenever you're ready, I'll still be here." One afternoon, wind swept through the back row of houses, blowing away the blanket Mrs. Ruth had laid in the yard. The sky turned to lead, and snow began to fall, quiet but slicing cold. She shut the windows tight, added more wood to the fireplace, and murmured with a tinge of worry, "I wonder if Eli will come tonight." At 8 o'clock, she cracked open the back door, just a sliver so the wind wouldn't rush in, and she saw Eli. It was curled up in the old cardboard box she had set out in the garden. The towel was soaked through, clinging to its frail body. It trembled in waves. She couldn't see its eyes clearly, but she knew it was exhausted. For the first time, she stepped out. The wind slapped her face like tiny blades. Her silver hair whipped in the cold. She knelt by the porch, voice trembling. "Come in, darling. It's too cold tonight." Eli lifted its head barely. It didn't spring up and flee like before, didn't hiss. It just looked at her, a long, quiet look. Then, like a leaf that had soaked in frost too long, Eli moved. One step, then another, slow, cautious, and it crossed the threshold. No sound, no drama, just a quiet entry into the warm kitchen. It lay down right beside the glowing hearth, curled up, closed its eyes. Mrs. Ruth stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Her heart skipped a beat, her chest tight with something incredibly delicate. Eli had entered the house for the first time, and from that day on, it never left. It didn't jump on the bed, nor did it climb onto the furniture. It simply lay near the fireplace. Every morning, when Mrs. Ruth came down to the kitchen, Eli was already awake, sitting there, waiting. It never meowed, but as soon as she walked in, it would let out a low purr, like an unspoken greeting. Gradually, Eli began taking small steps around the house, exploring corners, quiet as a polite guest. When Mrs. Ruth poured tea, it lay under the table. When she cooked, it curled near her feet, eyes just open enough to watch. One day, Mrs. Ruth gently reached out and touched its head. Eli flinched, old instincts resurfacing, but only for a moment. It didn't run, just lowered its head, as if to say, "Okay, I allow it." And she cried, not simply out of emotion, but because after so many years living in a noisy world where people passed one another without even a glance, a creature, once hurt, once terrified, had given her the privilege of being touched. A touch, so light, but enough to soften an entire winter in her heart. One day she turned on the radio. A jazz tune from long ago floated through the air. Eli curled up in a wool blanket, eyes half closed, and when the trumpet rose to its peak, she saw its tail flick gently. "You like music?" she asked, half joking, half sincere. Eli didn't answer, just turned its head toward her, those gray eyes no longer guarded, but as if listening. Each morning, Eli watched the snow fall from the window. Each night it lay beside her, not pressed close, but near enough for warmth to pass between them. Those silent days turned out not to be meaningless, for in the stillness, Eli learned to trust. And Mrs. Ruth, for the first time in many years, learned how to love without fear of loss. One evening, Mrs. Ruth made grilled salmon. It had been her and her husband's favorite. She cut a small piece and placed it on the porcelain plate by the fireplace. Eli didn't come right away, but after a while it wandered over, sat down, didn't eat immediately, just looked at her, then stretched its neck and let out a tiny purr. Not the usual sound a cat makes. It was more like a soft sigh of gratitude. And Mrs. Ruth in that moment felt as if someone had placed a small flower in her heart. Not showy, just warm. Since the day Eli entered her home, something in the air had changed. Not the sounds, the house was still quiet as before, not the scent. The kitchen still smelled faintly of black tea and aged wood, but something hard to name. As if every brick, every door, every stair had begun to breathe again after a long cold sleep. Eli wasn't a clingy cat. It remained calm and reserved, like one who had endured too much and learned to tread lightly to avoid being hurt again. But ever since it took refuge by the hearth, it never left. And every morning Mrs. Ruth woke up to find a small creature curled on the old rug, breathing steadily, warm, and at peace. At first, Eli still slept cautiously. A clatter from the kitchen or a strange footstep outside would make it spring up, eyes wide, ears flattened. But over time, it slept more deeply. It began to doze off to the crackling of firewood and to the soft sound of Mrs. Ruth reading at night. She often read from her husband's old books. She kept the whole shelf covered in dust but never given away. Now they had someone to listen. When she read, Eli lay at her feet, purring softly every time she paused, as if nudging her to go on, or simply saying, "I'm still here." Mrs. Ruth began noticing small changes in Eli and in herself. Eli's fur began to grow back, softer now, though still patchy. The stump where the ear had been began to heal, and the scar around its neck faded. But what moved her most wasn't the physical changes, it was the eyes. Those gray eyes, once deep with fear and suspicion, now glowed like embers on the verge of reigniting. One day she watched Eli lying on his side on the rug, eyes half closed, belly rising and falling gently, and her heart clenched. Not from worry, but from love. A kind of love that didn't speak, didn't rush, just quietly rose like a silent tide. And what about her? No one noticed the woman was changing. Neighbors didn't pay attention, but each new tablecloth she laid out, each time she refilled the teapot, the way she hummed softly while doing dishes, these were silent testaments. She started laughing to herself when Eli knocked over the calendar or jumped at the sight of its own reflection. Every small act of Eli's sparked something she thought long forgotten, pure joy. Joy simply because it is who it is, and it is here. One morning, Eli disappeared. Mrs. Ruth became so worried that she circled the house 3 times, opened every window, called softly, and checked under the bed. Just as she was about to go outside, Eli popped its head out from the woodpile, eyes squinting, face dusted in soot, but perfectly fine. She wasn't mad, just sat down, placed her hand on its head, and exhaled, releasing the whole heavy morning. That night, Eli lay by her feet, not moving once. Mrs. Ruth started writing again. The brown leather journal, once forgotten in a drawer, was taken out. On each page, she recorded the day, the weather, and small events. Today, Eli ate all the fish. Eli slept by the fire from noon till dusk, didn't startle when the doorbell rang. I feel alive again. No one needed to read it, but writing made her feel like she was touching life instead of merely passing through it. On a Sunday morning, she walked to the backyard with a pouch of daisy seeds. Spring was coming, she thought. It had been a long time since she planted flowers. Eli followed behind, paws light as wind. As she bent to sow the seeds, Eli lay beside her, eyes to the sky. Flowers will grow here, Eli. Just like you. From a trembling shadow to one brave enough to sleep peacefully in this world. One rainy afternoon, Eli climbed onto the chair and gently stepped into her lap. No more cautious creeping. It lay on her, head resting on her chest like a child, its ear pressed to her heart, listening. And Mrs. Ruth sat there, not speaking, not moving, not thinking, just feeling, each heartbeat, each breath, blending as though they had never been strangers. They say some relationships need no words, only presence. Eli couldn't speak, but every soft purr, every backward glance waiting for her, every paw that tugged the blanket at night told long, loving stories. And Mrs. Ruth, a woman who had lived nearly her whole life in silence, now learned that stillness could be sweet. One day, she opened the old storage boxes of her late husband, those untouched keepsakes. Inside was a small collar he had once planned to buy for a cat if they ever adopted a pet after retirement. She picked it up, sky blue, with a tiny bell at the end. She sat down and called Eli. It came, calm and unhurried. She fastened the collar around its neck. It fit perfectly, strangely so. When Eli walked, the bell rang, clear and gentle, like a soft reminder, I'm here and I belong. And Mrs. Ruth knew, in a world far too noisy, the way Eli loved her with silence, with deep eyes, with total trust, was the truest kind of miracle. No fireworks, just a once abandoned cat, now sleeping in the arms of someone who once thought her heart had gone quiet forever. That morning, everything seemed normal. The first sunlight of the week streamed through the kitchen window, casting a soft golden glow on familiar things. The porcelain teapot, the old lace tablecloth, and the wooden chair where Mrs. Ruth sat each morning, reading a few pages or simply gazing at the garden, where the wild daisies had just begun to bud after a long frozen winter. But something was strange. Eli didn't get out of bed. Usually, as soon as the sun peeked through the window, Eli would come to her feet, nuzzle into the hem of her dress, or jump onto the chair beside her, those half-closed eyes waiting for a gentle pat, a soft morning greeting. But today, the small blanket by the fireplace remained undisturbed. No purring, no paw steps, no familiar shadow. Mrs. Ruth set down her teacup, a quiet ache forming in her chest. Not panic, but the kind of heaviness that comes from a knowing, a kind of intuition that doesn't need words or reasons to pull your heart down. She walked into the living room. Eli was still there, lying on the soft wool blanket, curled up just like always, but something about the stillness felt deeper than usual. She sank to her knees and called softly, Eli. No reply. She reached out, touching its back gently, still warm, but the breathing was shallow, so faint she had to hold her own breath to hear it. Eli didn't open his eyes, but its eyelids twitched as if trying to summon back the last flicker of consciousness. Oh, my sweet one. Her voice caught in her throat. She lifted it slowly, so carefully, as if afraid she might break something fragile on the verge of vanishing. Its body was feather-light, as if it no longer held weight, only skin, bones, and the trace of a life barely holding on. She sat by the window, in her wooden chair, placing Eli gently in her lap. She cradled it against her chest, one hand stroking its back, the other holding its head to her shoulder. Outside, the morning sun rose. Golden light spilled over her shoulders and warmed Eli's gray fur. Dust motes floated through the air, tiny, glimmering like they were dancing. She looked out at the garden, where the wind softly stirred the wild daisies, and her eyes blurred. Not from sobbing, but from a tear that rose, touched the edge of her lashes, and fell, quiet as the first spring rain on an old tin roof. "You're home now, Eli." Her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were speaking to a soul. Eli stirred, a movement so small it could barely be seen, then nudged its head against her chest. Its eyes stayed shut, but she knew it heard her. And then it purred, a sound as soft as wind slipping through trees, as quiet as a leaf falling in the middle of the night, so gentle you could only hear it with your heart, just one sound. Then Eli grew still. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because some pain doesn't need to be spoken. It simply sits there, present-like, a cut without blood, like a hollow in your chest you know will never be filled again. She sat like that for a long time, holding Eli, watching the sunlight stretch across the windowsill, listening as time dripped slowly into her heart. That afternoon she carried Eli to the backyard, to a quiet corner beneath the old tree where the morning sun always reached, where the daisies had just begun to bloom in their fragile petals. She had already dug the hole. No one helped, no one watched, just her and the earth. Eli was wrapped in the old wool blanket, once her husband's. She laid him down gently, tucking the edges like she was lulling a child to sleep. She bowed her head and whispered, "You were brave, Eli. Thank you for showing me my heart could still love. Thank you for choosing to stay, even if it was only for a little while." She didn't make a gravestone, just placed a single sprig of dried lavender, a flower with a scent as soft as sleep, and one her husband had once loved most. That night the house returned to silence. The fireplace still glowed. The tea still smelled sweet, but the rug at her feet was empty. Each time she unconsciously glanced toward the familiar spot, her heart clenched, and then she reminded herself, he's not in pain anymore. And out of habit, she still placed a little dish of milk by the back door every morning, not because she expected Eli to return, but as a way of saying, there's still a place for you here, always. The following month, the daisies bloomed gold across the garden corner. Mrs. Ruth sat by the door and wrote in her brown leather journal, "Eli is no longer here, but I know. He's not far. Maybe he's lying somewhere on a cloud where there's sunlight and birdsong and no one ever hurts him again. And here I will keep living because Eli lived bravely until the very end. And if one day I close my eyes, I hope he's the first to come running, to nuzzle my hand and purr softly, just like that morning." No one else ever knew Eli existed, except Mrs. Ruth, but to her, Eli was the only miracle of her final years. Not a dream, not some fairy tale falling from the sky, but a battered, scruffy old cat, once beaten, abandoned, discarded, who still believed in the gaze of a stranger. And because of that, they found each other in the most beautiful moment. And the last, the garden corner where she buried Eli, wasn't the most special spot in the yard. No stone statues, no white fences, no brilliant flowers, just a patch of earth under the old tree where the evening light often cast warm patterns on the thin layer of snow. But it had been Eli's favorite place. He used to curl up there in the late afternoon, quietly, eyes to the sky, as if remembering something long past, or simply enjoying a peace he never had until he met her. Now it was his resting place. She didn't need a gravestone. Eli didn't need a name etched in stone to be remembered. Instead, she placed a sprig of dried lavender, a flower she used to grow as a young bride in the very first garden she and her husband shared. Lavender wasn't as dazzling as roses, nor as grand as tulips, but it was fragrant, gentle, and resilient, just like Eli's presence in her life, quiet but unforgettable. The lavender leaned against the snow, a pale purple touch against white frost. Simple, humble, and heartbreakingly beautiful. A single bloom in the snow. It didn't need to blossom. It just needed to be there. And that was enough. From that day on, every morning, Mrs. Ruth placed a small dish by the back door. Not for a cat, and certainly not because she forgot Eli was gone, but for memory. For the presence that once was so real, so vivid, that had once lain there, breathing softly by her feet, nuzzling her hand, giving her days a reason to go on. The little dish was always clean, set gently at the doorstep, a silent ritual. Others might not understand, but she did. Every time she placed it down, she was whispering to Eli, "You're still here, and I'm still living with the love you left behind." Some days the snow fell thick and heavy. The whole garden was buried, but the lavender sprig still peeked through, spindly but unbowed. Mrs. Ruth looked out the window, her eyes landing on that trembling bloom. Her heart tightened, then softened, as if Eli were still there, lying beneath the tree, watching her through the fog on the glass. Maybe love is like lavender. It doesn't need to be loud or praised. It just has to survive the winter, quiet and unwavering, reminding us that what was once real and beautiful never truly disappears. These days, Mrs. Ruth no longer turns on the radio in the morning. Instead, she sat still, watched the snow melt, watched the sparrows flutter past her porch, and jotted down little lines in her notebook. "I miss Eli every day, but the missing doesn't hurt anymore. It's like a wind chime, soft, sometimes sad, but it still makes my heart smile. The lavender hasn't wilted yet. I think it's trying to stay a little longer too. I never thought an old scruffy cat could teach me to forgive the past and love life again." Once a week, Mrs. Ruth went out to the garden. She sat beside the lavender. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes she just sat quietly. She didn't apologize. She didn't make promises. She simply said, "You passed through my life like a breeze, but that breeze carried warmth." One day, the little neighbor girl knocked on the door. "Mrs. Ruth, why do you always leave a dish by the door? Is there still a cat that comes?" Mrs. Ruth smiled, but didn't answer right away. Then she knelt down, brushed the girl's hair back, and said, "Yes, but it's a cat only I can see. It comes in the morning, in a very special way." The girl blinked, then nodded, the way children do when they still believe in magic. Inside the little kitchen, everything was the same. But somewhere in the sunlight streaming through the curtains, in the wisp of steam from a cup of tea, in the pages of a book left open, Eli was there, not in body, but in love. A flower in the snow, a small light in winter, a whisper in the stillness. Eli didn't live long. He had no grand life, no admirers, no fancy ribbon or velvet bed. He was just an old cat, beaten, forgotten, tossed aside, a creature the world never cared to name. But Eli lived long enough to soothe a heart that had begun to wither, long enough to awaken in one quiet old woman the feelings she thought time had erased, long enough to bloom a flower in the snow. Mrs. Ruth still lives in that little house. Every day she walks out to the garden, looks toward the patch of ground where the lavender leans in the breeze, and each morning she still places a porcelain dish by the door, a ritual for loyalty, for a love that once was real. To her, Eli was never just a poor stray cat. He was her final miracle, quiet, humble, unassuming, but enough to bring her heart back to life. She once thought she was just waiting to die, but Eli reminded her, love can arrive late, but it's never too late. And perhaps those who have known loneliness, who've been forgotten, who've been lost, understand better than anyone the worth of a gentle touch, a long gaze, a silent presence that is still completely real. Because sometimes a creature thought to be nameless is the very reason we open our hearts again. Have you ever met an Eli in your life? A person, an animal, or even just a fleeting moment that came, touched you and left, but lit a small flame in your heart that never went out? If so, tell us, because sharing is how we keep love alive, even when love has gone to rest. Leave a comment below. And if this story made you feel a little softer, a little more healed, don't forget to follow the channel so we can continue journeying together through small, warm, and honest stories like this. Because somewhere out there are still Elis waiting to be seen. And maybe one day you'll be someone's miracle, just like Eli once was.